Hello? Test 1, 2, 3. All right, I believe we're ready to get started. So my name is Corey Schell. I'm a senior cybersecurity consultant with Dean Dorton. I've got several certifications, including the Certified Information System Security Professional, Certified Information Security Manager. I'm a certified ethical hacker, and also have a Hacking Forensic Investigator certification as well. So I will be taking questions at the end of this presentation, and then I will also be providing my contact information to you. So if you'd like to follow up with me after the presentation, you may follow up with me directly via email. Okay, we'll get started with the objectives. We've got a lot of content to go through over the next hour. We're going to start with reviewing recent cybersecurity threats and trends. We're going to move on to everybody's favorite topic, which is a typical ransomware attack chain. We'll show you what a typical ransomware attack looks like, and then strategies that your institution can adopt to be more resilient against those types of threats. Then we're going to move on to discuss the need for multi-layer cybersecurity approach, otherwise known as defense in depth. And then I'll go over some common observations of issues and default configuration settings pertaining to cloud security, specifically with Office 365. We'll then discuss multi-factor authentication in a bit more depth, as well as password security. That's another favorite topic everyone has, is good password practices. We'll also go over the Microsoft Secure Score, what that means, and how that can help you improve your security with Office 365. And then we'll close by discussing what a proactive cybersecurity management program looks like, and then I will leave you an IT security and cybersecurity checklist that can help you improve security in your organization. So we'll start with, what are we seeing? Everyone may have heard of a ubiquitous piece of software, a vulnerability that was published in late December last year called Log4j. And this is software that's it's in a popular Java locking package, and it's literally everywhere. It affects millions of businesses, software applications, and as we perform security assessments for organizations, we find this Log4j vulnerability in pretty much every environment that we look at. The good news is that for a lot of organizations, their vulnerable software is behind their firewall, meaning it's not internet facing, and so the bad guys can't exploit it directly. But we did observe attacks late last year and early this year in which clients had internet facing applications like VMware that were internet facing, and they were attacked. And we're likely going to continue to see attacks over the course of the year, and probably even years after, that are targeting this specific vulnerability. So I'd highly recommend that organizations perform patch and vulnerability management and take a proactive look at your environment to look for this vulnerability, because it is something that especially ransomware threat actors are looking to exploit. And then also something that we observed last year, did anybody here have any trouble at all printing last year? There was a pretty significant vulnerability that was patched by Microsoft called Print Nightmare, and it was literally a nightmare for IT departments. And it was months of patches that caused a bunch of printing issues, but the reason it was so important is the print spooler service runs by default in every version of Windows, whether it's a workstation, a server, or domain controller. And so what that vulnerability allowed for, if it wasn't patched, is if a bad guy gained a foothold on a single desktop computer in your environment, they could compromise your entire network if that vulnerability wasn't patched, especially on the domain controllers. And that's exactly why a lot of IT departments were scrambling to get that patch deployed, because it really was an easy button for the bad guys if they got a foothold into your network. And oh, by the way, there's a similar vulnerability that Microsoft just fixed last month. So we're continuing to see these high-profile, wormable vulnerabilities, especially with Microsoft platforms, that IT departments really need to stay on top of and ensure they're patching them. Otherwise, it makes it very easy for ransomware threat actors to broadly exploit and gain access to everything if they gain a foothold in your organization. And we also observed numerous high-profile breaches of Microsoft, Okta, NVIDIA, Samsung, and others by the Lapsus group. And they achieved those breaches by compromising user identities. So they got people's passwords. Something else they did is they did what's called SIM swapping to facilitate account takeover. So what that was for people they were targeting that had multi-factor authentication, and they would get a text message when they log in with their password. They were calling the service providers, AT&T, Verizon, and they were pretending to be their target and convincing them to swap their SIM card so that if they got their target's password, they could get the provider to swap SIMs, and then they could get that SMS text to their phone, intercept it, and log in as them. Something else that they were doing is especially some of these big companies like Microsoft, Okta, they have agreements with third parties. They outsource some of their basic help desk functions and whatnot. So this group was also going after these contractors and offering them Bitcoin if they gave them access. Hey, we'll give you several Bitcoin if you just click on this link and give us a foothold. So they've actively been going after some of those contractors trying to buy their access in. And it's worth noting that as of a month or two ago, several teenagers, especially in the UK, have been arrested in connection with this group. So they have arrested some of the people that are a part of this group. And then also the crisis in Ukraine and Russia. There's been multiple cybersecurity advisories over the past few months since the war in Ukraine started. And the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA, they published an advisory called Shields Up. And what they're saying is that businesses should be prepared to defend against cyber attacks originating from Russia, stating that every organization, large and small, must be prepared to respond to disruptive cyber activity. So while we're not aware of any specific or credible threats to the United States at this time, the invasion of Ukraine could lead to some very large-scale cybersecurity attacks in the near future, especially since a lot of these threat actor groups that are predominantly in Eastern Europe or in Russia have really come out and pledged their allegiance to Russia. So we do recommend you keep an eye on that advisory. They're stating your immediate action should be to patch vulnerabilities. Specifically, I mentioned Print Nightmare and Log4j earlier. We got that vulnerability that was published last month. Use MFA. We're going to go over that a lot more. Run your antivirus software. Monitor it effectively. Make sure it's updated frequently. Employ strong spam filter or email filtering. And then disable ports and protocols that are not essential. If you've got internet infrastructure that's internet facing that doesn't need to be, take it down, and that can reduce your attack surface. You should also be periodically getting external security assessments, pen tests, or vulnerability assessments to make sure you don't have anything misconfigured or internet facing that shouldn't be. And then lastly, they state strengthen controls for cloud services. So that's going to be another major topic of this discussion. So the latest updates, I actually updated this slide today because yesterday Verizon released their annual data breach investigations report. So I haven't had time to go through the entire report in length, but I did review the section on higher education. I've got a link to that on this slide if you want to download and review that report. But the main takeaway from that report is that for higher education, you're at a higher risk of credential theft and you're at a higher risk of ransomware than a lot of other industries. And those are two of the root causes of a lot of these data breach, or if you look at what types of data breaches or incidents occurred for higher education, it's all credential theft. People are getting their passwords stolen and ransomware. And sometimes these incidents are intertwined. It's not just credential theft or ransomware. Sometimes it's both. And we'll go over that in more depth on another slide. And then also on March 9th, CISA published an advisory along with the FBI, the NSA, as well as other security agencies from our partners throughout the world, including more information specifically focused on Russian cyber threat actors and ransomware affiliates. So I do recommend you check that out. If you would like that advisory, just follow up with me after the presentation. I'll be sure to email that to you. They also maintain a list of all the vulnerabilities that they've observed these ransomware threat actors specifically targeting, so that you have a reference for the vulnerabilities you need to address in your environment. Okay, so now let's go over ransomware. Okay, I hope everybody can see this slide okay. So I've got two screenshots here, and these are both showing you a typical ransomware attack chain. So if you look at the picture on the left, this is a diagram that shows the attack chain that a threat actor follows from their initial foothold, which would be maybe when a user opens up an attachment or they click a link and download and run their malware, all the way to the bottom, which is their action on objectives. That's when they actually deploy the ransomware. So there's multiple phases of this attack that they have to go through before they deploy that ransomware. And if you look at the screenshot on the right, the way this typically starts out is with a phishing email. And so this could be, you have an employee who receives an email maybe from somebody they know or they've had recent correspondence with that says, hey, here's that document, here's that invoice you asked for, here's that RFP. And then, when the user opens it, not realizing that the person they just received the email from had their email mailbox compromised. So they're receiving an email from that person, but that person's been hacked. They'll open up a typically Word document, Excel spreadsheet with macros. It'll prompt the user to enable content and allow the macro to run. And once they do that, a PowerShell stager is going to run in the background and try to download malware on their computer. So specifically, the Emotet malware, it's very good at evading detection from regular old plain traditional antivirus. And it's really good at establishing persistence. So it embeds itself within the operating system. That way, if the user shuts off their computer, they restart it, it's going to connect back out to the attacker's command and control when they turn their computer back on or log back into the computer. It's going to download the secondary payload, which is typically TrickBot, which is full of tricks. And they're not, it'll disable antivirus software. It's really good at doing that. It'll harvest data from the person's computer. It'll steal their credentials, and not just their Active Directory password. It'll steal all the passwords they've saved in their web browsers, Firefox, Chrome, Internet Explorer. It'll harvest all of the contact names and email addresses from your address list in your address book and Outlook, and then it's going to target all of them. So they'll be if your account gets compromised, they'll be getting an email from your account trying to get them to download and run the same malware. And then it's also really good at spreading throughout the network, like a worm. And it does this typically by brute forcing, weak passwords for accounts, or stealing like a local admin password specifically if it's shared on a computer. And then you'll notice after all this has been done, after your data's been exfiltrated, after your credentials have been harvested, and the threat actor has them, the last step here is they're going to deploy the ransomware. So typically, when you've been hit by ransomware, they've already got all of your credentials, not just your Active Directory credentials. It could be your payroll, system credentials. It could be they're logging into your Office 365 environment. So while everybody's scrambling, trying to recover from the ransomware, they're logging into all these web applications that people had saved in their browsers. In the past year, we've observed a decrease in the dwell time, which is, when I say dwell time, let me define that. So dwell time is the time it takes from when the bad guy gets a foothold in your network for them to achieve their objective, which is typically exfiltration of data, extortion, and ransomware. You used to have a period of days from the time that person clicked the link in the email to whenever everything got encrypted with ransomware. We're seeing that shrink to hours. So I've got two links at the bottom of the slide. One is a detailed analysis of a ransomware attack that took 2 hours from the time that an employee clicked the link in the email to everything being ransomed, and then the other was 5 hours. So that dwell time is shrinking rapidly, and your responders have much less time to respond to an intrusion than they used to. Specifically because this is a pretty sophisticated type of malware, and a lot of these actions can be done autonomously without any hands on keyboard. So I've been pulled into ransomware incidents where we've observed every computer on the network had TrickBot on it. Everything was infected, and it only took a matter of hours from that infestation to spread and for it to have a massive impact to the organization. And then also, the very bottom link on this slide, if you email it to me, I'll be glad to share it with you. It's a really good blog article from Brian Krebs. He's got a blog called Krebs on Security, and the title of that blog entry is The Hidden Cost of Ransomware, Wholesale Password Theft. So, the vast majority of ransomware incidents are not only is your whole your organization being hit by ransomware and you've got to recover from backups, but they've also stolen credentials for a lot of things, not just your Active Directory. Okay, so we'll move to the next slide. Now, I love this slide here because this shows you a typical ransomware attack chain, but it also shows you what you can do across that attack chain to mitigate risk and reduce the likelihood of a ransomware attack affecting your organization. So, highlights the 3 stages of a ransomware incident. In the first phase, the threat actor gains access to the network, they take control of systems, and then they deploy their malware payload to infect your other systems and other devices. So a variety of controls layered throughout the network can enhance your ability to defend against the ransomware. And that includes, I think first off, one of the most important things is providing your employees with cybersecurity awareness training. So that they're aware of things like phishing and the red flags to look for. Use strong passwords and actually preferably passphrases to prevent threat actors from being successful on brute force attempts. And we're going to go over that in more depth later on password practices. You also need to implement multi-factor authentication. We'll discuss that in much more depth later. Scan your systems for vulnerabilities as much as you can. Internally and externally preferably. Segment your network to ensure sensitive or high value information is in a different zone of the network. And then set up monitoring and logging functionality for your systems and networks, and we'll go over that in more depth later. One of the other things you can do that's highly effective against malware that I mentioned earlier, like Emotet and TrickBot, is it's commonly distributed through macro malware, malicious Microsoft Office files. You can actually easily flip a setting and group policy that will disable or block macros that are downloaded from the internet. So for organizations that I've seen do that, we used to see, like several macro malware documents that would slip through a spam filter a month. And then we would, disable macros from the internet for that client, and it'd go effectively to 0. Because even if something slipped through the spam filter and the user opened it and they try to run it, they would get a message that says macros are blocked by your administrator, contact them if you need access. So, and that doesn't prevent, especially like people in your finance office, account receivable, from being able to run macro documents that are hosted internally that are trusted. It's just those bad Office files that are commonly distributed via email. So in the second stage of the ransomware attack, where the threat actor takes control, I think 2 of the most effective things are implement endpoint detection and response software, or EDR software, firewalls, and then also apply the principle of least privilege. And we'll go over that in more depth later. And the third stage of the ransomware incident, the number one mitigation that you can implement for your organization is your backup plan. You need to ensure that you have multiple copies of your backup stored offline, if possible in the cloud as well. And by having your backups disconnected from your network, the threat actors cannot delete them or infect them with the ransomware. And you should also ensure you test your backups and your restore processes on a regularly scheduled basis and adjust any issues to ensure that your backup files are ready for you to recover quickly in the event of a ransomware incident. You don't want to wait until it happens and then try to recover, only to realize that there's some error or misconfiguration that prevents the restoration. Okay, so this slide, if you really want to be very resilient against ransomware threats, this is something I highly recommend that if you're a stakeholder or influencer in your organization, you have a discussion or conversation with your IT department about implementing. So most environments that we assess and look at, IT people will generally have two accounts. They'll have their standard user account that they log in for their daily functions like checking email, surfing the web, and then they'll have an administrator account that typically gets used everywhere. Domain controllers, servers, workstations. Well, the risk with that is, like we just discussed previously on those ransomware slides, threat actors are very crafty. They've got tools that allow them to map out attack paths when they get a foothold in the organization, so they know where the IT people are logging into, and they know what computers to target to try and get domain admin credentials. And so if your IT people are logging in everywhere as domain admin, well, it only takes them probably a couple hours from when they get that foothold to compromise the entire network. With a tiered privilege model, and this is something that Microsoft recommends, it's something that Mandiant recommends, which actually was just acquired by Microsoft. The great news about this is free. It doesn't cost you any money. All you need to implement this is Active Directory and group policy. And the first phase of it would be that your IT people, instead of having 2 accounts, well, now they've got 4 accounts. They've got a regular user account, they've got a workstation admin account, server admin, and a domain admin. The second phase is you put restrictions in place that prevent them from logging in into lower tiered assets with higher tiered accounts. So as an example, they won't be able to log into a workstation as a domain admin. They have to use their workstation admin account. They won't be able to log into a member server as a domain admin. This greatly complicates the process or the playbook that a ransomware threat actor follows, because they're used to, when they get that foothold, it doesn't take much effort for them to escalate to domain admin. When you have this type of model in place, which is free, doesn't cost any money, it greatly increases the dwell time. It increases the amount of time that it takes from them to go from that initial foothold to achieving their objective. And it's one of the most effective strategies that I've seen so far that allows you to be more resilient against these types of threats. So in addition to that type of model, there's also another free tool from Microsoft called Local Administrator Password Solution, or LAPS. And what that tool does is it rotates passwords for local admin accounts and makes sure they're unique. Because one of the strategies that a bad guy is going to do when they gain a foothold on the computer, they're going to use software to dump credentials and hashes from that computer. And if there's a local admin account that's shared on multiple systems, like you've got a shared local admin account on every workstation or server, they're going to be able to spread to other computers with that local admin account password. So that's another thing that allows them to spread quickly after that initial foothold. If you use that free tool called LAPS to make sure every computer has a random and unique password, that also greatly increases the dwell time and makes that attack path much more difficult for the bad guys. Okay, so now we're going to discuss defense in depth, or a multi-layered security approach. So a good cybersecurity program is like an onion in which you have multiple layers, so that if a threat actor is able to get through one layer, there's another layer that they have to go through. So looking at external security, that is the security of your internet-facing presence. You should be at least periodically assessing your internet-facing infrastructure for vulnerabilities. There's actually some free vulnerability assessment services out there. There's one offered by CISA called the Cyber Hygiene Service. It is a free service you can sign up for and get weekly reports on your attack surface and vulnerabilities for your internet-facing infrastructure. Another thing to look at with external security is how your employees, how faculty and staff gain remote access and how they authenticate. Does it just take a password for them to log into a system? Because if it does, they're probably at a higher likelihood of compromise. Also looking at endpoint security, what type of endpoint protection solution you have. Is it broadly deployed? Is it updated? Is it maintained? Is it monitored? How are software updates and patch management addressed? Are third-party patches addressed? Are Microsoft updates addressed? Are updates for other infrastructure like VMware addressed. Are you periodically doing internal vulnerability scans looking for vulnerabilities on those endpoints? Then also look at account security. So that includes things like your password policy, and if you've got a password filter. So we'll go over that more later when we get to a section specifically on password management. And then also looking at tiered access controls if you've implemented a tiered access model like we just discussed. And then two of the most common vectors for bad things to get into your network are email and web. And so two of the most important security controls you can have in place are email filtering, which we're going to discuss in more depth in another slide, and then also your web security. Web filtering. How are you filtering malicious or potentially nefarious content online for your end users? And then end user awareness training. Is your staff periodically apprised of the latest cybersecurity threats and common things to look for, like phishing, red flags? And then looking at your backup procedures, backup and recovery procedures. And then I think the last thing to look at in your onion of security is how you're managing risk for cloud systems. Because especially in higher education, a lot of people have moved to Office 365, other people maybe moved to Google, but how are you managing risk in those platforms? So we're going to go over security tools in a little bit more depth here. So I think one of the most important things that your institution should be doing is multi-factor authentication, and that's where you've got a combination of something you have, something you know, and something you are. And then also looking at cybersecurity insurance questionnaires, I would be surprised if you're able to secure cybersecurity insurance or get a renewal in 2022 if you're not doing MFA for all remote access, and we'll go over that in more depth later. The other thing you should be looking at is next generation antivirus and EDR, and so I'll clarify what that is. So modern attacks like ransomware are becoming more prevalent, and next generation attacks can be thwarted by it's commonly referred to as next generation antivirus or NGAV, and really those are more behavioral based. So it doesn't require a signature to block a specific piece of malware. It analyzes things based on its behavior, and going a step beyond that, not just prevention, but giving your staff or your security team the ability to detect and respond to intrusions that have circumvented that prevention is really important. And there's a bunch of EDR tools out there like Carbon Black, CrowdStrike. Microsoft has their own solution called Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. There's SentinelOne. There's several of them. But I do think that that's becoming more imperative to have a solution like that in place to be able to detect and respond to those types of attacks in a sufficient amount of time before they can become full-scale breaches. And then also an advanced web filter. With the increase in remote work, you may have staff or faculty that take their laptop home, and if you're only doing, say, web filtering at the firewall in your perimeter and they don't have some type of agent or something that follows them home, well, then you may be losing an important piece of security when that laptop leaves your network. So having some type of advanced web filter that they can have a roaming agent that follows them so that you can enforce your same security policy regardless of whatever location they're at, and they don't have to be connected via VPN or behind the web filter. And then lastly, advanced email protection. There's a lot of vendors out there that provide that, like Mimecast, Proofpoint, Barracuda. Microsoft has a platform called Defender for Office 365, and we'll go over that in more depth on the next slide. So when it comes to email security, we're going over those attack chains earlier, and a lot of these ransomware attacks start out from an email somebody got. So having really good email security practices and tools in place are really important. So we'll start with the email filtering policies. It's not uncommon for us to see when we assess client environments that their policies haven't been tweaked, or maybe they've been, maybe people were reporting, hey, I've got too much stuff going to spam, and so the policies were tweaked and they become too permissive and maybe opened up the floodgates for spam and phishing. Another thing you should be considering doing is having an email warning banner, so that if you have somebody receives an email that comes from outside the organization, they get a banner that says, hey, this email's from the outside, it didn't come internal, use caution with any links or attachments. That can be an effective deterrent. Sometimes there's impersonation emails that come in pretending to be somebody from inside the organization. And if you've got that banner warning that, hey, this came from outside, sometimes that can alert the end user that, hey, this isn't from us, or this isn't from who I think it is. You should also block high-risk file extension types and content. And for anybody that has delegated that responsibility, I can provide you a full list of the types of file extensions you should be blocking. Probably at the top of the list is zip attachments. And more often than not, a lot of malicious malware will be delivered as a zip file that's password protected, and then the bad guy will have the password in the body of the email that says, hey, here's the password to open this encrypted archive. And the reason they do that is not all spam filters can scan those archives for malware if it's encrypted. The other thing you should be considering doing link protection. So what that is any link that is in the body of the email, normally with normal spam filters, if you click the link, it's going to take you to whatever site that is, unless your firewall or your web filter blocks you. With link protection, what will happen is your email security vendor will rewrite that hyperlink so that when you click the link, instead of taking you directly to it, it takes you to the vendor, like Microsoft or Mimecast or Proofpoint, and then they scan that link on their back end to confirm it's safe before they redirect you and allow you to the original site. Or they'll redirect you to a blog page that says, hey, we scanned this and it's malicious. It's another layer in your defense in-depth tools. It's another layer in your onion of security. The other thing is attachment sandboxing. So plain old spam filters are like plain old traditional antivirus. If they don't have a signature that matches a file, if it doesn't know already that that file is malicious, it's typically going to allow it through. If you've got an advanced email filter that includes what's called sandboxing, every attachment that comes into the email gateway is going to get detonated in a sandbox and analyzed on its behavior. So it's not just taking a look to say, do I know this file is malicious? It's going to say, okay, what happens when this file gets opened? What's it trying to do? What links are in the file? Is it trying to run macros? And then based on that analysis, it'll choose to block it, quarantine it, or strip it out from the email. That can cause a slight delay. So like if I email you an attachment, it may not come immediately to you. It may take 3 minutes or 5 minutes. But typically the benefit for security outweighs the delay you might have from that being detonated in a sandbox. The next important thing you need to consider doing is impersonation protection. I don't know if anybody here has heard of or seen emails that come that pretend to be from the CEO saying, hey, I need you to buy some gift cards, or the president saying, hey, I have an urgent request, please respond to me, and I need the gift cards for this event. Or sometimes HR gets contacted from supposedly an employee that needs to change their payroll information. But if you look real closely at the from address, you'll see it's like some random gmail.com, AOL.com, some type of personal email account. And so a lot of these email vendors have what's called impersonation protection, which if you configure the policies, will actually block those emails that if they're trying to match your display name or include other information in the body of the email that says like president and it's got your name and your signature, it's going to look and say, well, no, this didn't come from the president. This came from this random Gmail or AOL account, and it's going to block it. But most spam filters don't have this configured out of the box. You have to configure it and you have to tweak it, and sometimes you have to license it. Your spam filter may not have that feature. The other thing that's important is to monitor and clean up your allowed list requests. So I've done assessments for organizations, and when we've looked at their allow list, it's large, hundreds or thousands of entries, sometimes full domains like allow all email for Microsoft.com. Or sometimes I've seen spam filters that are configured to allow internal domain names, which really opens up the floodgates for spam and phishing. So you definitely need to periodically review those allowed lists and prune them down a bit to mitigate risk. Also implement data loss prevention. If you look at the data breach investigations report, inevitably there's some user error that accounts for some breaches of data. Sometimes people are typing up email that contains PII to go out to somebody, and they mistype an email address and send it to an unintended recipient. So having DLP policies in place is important. Also to ensure that they're encrypted whenever you're sending any PII outside the organization. You also want to be sure your users are trained against phishing, especially spear phishing type attacks. And then ideally, do your own phishing simulations. There's actually some free tools out there, and there's some relatively inexpensive platforms that allow you to do your own periodic phishing simulations to assess, how prone people in your organization are to clicking on links they shouldn't or open up attachments they shouldn't. And that also kind of reinforces that training when you're doing those periodic simulations. And then lastly, another feature that a lot of these tools have is threat remediation. So instead of your IT people having to blast out an email to everybody saying, hey, if you got this email, don't click it, they actually have the ability through the filter to look at who did click it and then initiate remediation, say delete, do a hard delete or a soft delete of that item from everybody's mailbox. It makes it a lot easier when you're responding to those types of incidents whenever you have that kind of capability. Okay, so getting to multi-factor authentication. Okay, we're going to define this. Multi-factor authentication as two of the three things here: something you know, something you have, and something you are. And most commonly, that's something you know is a password. That's what we use to log into pretty much everything's a password. Something you have, a device like an iPhone, Android, iPad. Something you are, that's fingerprint, or think Face ID for like newer phones that actually scan your face to prove your identity. You want two of these three things. If you're relying on just a password to prove you are who you say you are, that's probably going to lead to an incident or a data breach, because threat actors are really good at stealing or guessing passwords. So I've got a pop quiz for everybody. According to Microsoft, what percentage of all Office 365 admin accounts require multi-factor authentication? It's 11%. So that's as of, I think, a year or two ago. I think a few years before that, up something like 2 or 3%. So it's starting to go up, but not nearly as high as it should be. But it's highly recommended that people in your environment that are highly privileged, billing administrators, global administrators, account administrators, should have multi-factor authentication in place. So now we're going to discuss cloud security in much more depth. So these numbers were published by Microsoft a few years ago. They haven't published newer numbers for these yet, but I can only imagine that they've increased. But in a single year, they had observed a 300% increase in identity attacks. So that's specifically attacks targeting Office 365 environments. In a single month, they observed 23 million compromised accounts from phishing. That's in a single month. Also in a single month, they observed 350,000 accounts that were compromised from password spray attacks. So a password spray is where a bad guy takes a common password that gets used broadly in multiple environments, like password 1 exclamation or summer 2022 exclamation, and they spray that password for hundreds of thousands of accounts. They only need to get one or two, and if once they compromise that one account, they can start targeting other people in that organization. Breach replay, this is also called credential stuffing. This is where threat actors take passwords from data breaches, maybe that have been published on the dark web or sold in an underground forum, and they're taking, because people have a habit to reuse the same password on multiple places, they'll take that common password and they'll just replay it for hundreds of thousands of accounts. In a single month, Microsoft observed what they determined to be 4.6 billion sign-in attempts that were from credential stuffing or breach replay. So unique passwords are very important to mitigate that. And I've got a nice infographic from Microsoft here. 4,000 daily ransomware attacks, 300 million daily fraudulent sign-in attempts, 167 million daily malware attacks. This is their numbers. 81% of breaches are caused by credential theft. People are getting their passwords stolen or guessed. Think like the Equifax data breach. There was a web interface that had the username and password of admin. So weakened default passwords. And this is Microsoft. They're stating that 99% of these identity attacks can be mitigated by multi-factor authentication. Now, it's not a silver bullet, but it is one of the most effective things that you can do to mitigate that risk of credential theft and to mitigate account takeover, especially in your Office 365 environment. And I mentioned earlier, there's things that threat actors can do, like the SIM swapping, where they gain somebody's password, they can call the cell provider and say, hey, I'm so-and-so, here's my information. I need to swap the SIM card, and they'll swap the SIM. But most of the time, MFA is sufficient to mitigate those attacks. Okay, so now I'm going to go over some common observations that I've had as an assessor of cloud environments. And so at the top of the list is auditing is disabled, and it's a default setting. And still, even in 2022, I get to look at cloud environments, and when I go to check the Unified Audit Log, I see it's disabled. So if they have an incident and they want to go back and look at the logs, there's none there. So that's really important. I've got another slide that shows you how to check, but you need to make sure, don't just assume that it's enabled. You need to verify that it's enabled. And then also another thing that we've observed is a lot of clients don't have the necessary license to get the full context of what items in a mailbox that's compromised were accessed. And so if you're trying to answer the question of what did the bad guy access in this mailbox, you might not be able to answer that question if you're not licensed for it. And you can't do it retroactively. So that's another important consideration. Another thing that we typically observe is a lot of organizations, and especially higher education, have a lower rate of adoption for multi-factor authentication, including highly privileged accounts like global admins. And remember, if a global admin account gets compromised, everything in your tenant is compromised because the threat actor has access to everything. Another thing that we observe is conditional access policies or security defaults are not enabled. I'll go into more depth on that on another slide. And then also, Microsoft leaves legacy protocols enabled. That's another default setting. So legacy protocols are protocols like IMAP, POP, SMTP, and those are the protocols that the bad guys use to do their password sprays. Like they'll do summer, spring, winter, 2022, password 1 exclamation. They're targeting those protocols when they do that. And so if you're not blocking them, you're at risk of those types of attacks where they can guess your password. And the scary thing is even if you've gone that step of enforcing MFA for everybody, if you're not disabling those legacy protocols, they can still compromise you. They can still get access to your mailbox even if you got the MFA in place. So that's another thing you really need to look at. Another common observation, a lot of clients that we work with don't maintain their secure score. They may not even know what it is. I'll go into more depth on that in another slide. IT admins don't typically separate their accounts for privileged access. They don't abide by the principle of least privilege. Very common for us to see the IT admins are using, like their standard user count is the global admin. You need to apply the same due diligence for the principle of least privilege as you would for an internal environment. And then also we see that all users are allowed to grant consent to unmanaged applications. That means any Office 365 user can grant consent to any application on the organization's behalf to their data by default. And I'll go over why that's risky in a second. Also, it's very common for us to see that IT staff are unable to retrieve sign-in logs or investigate risk events, and they're lacking the proper context due to inadequate licensing. So they've got basic licenses, and they don't have the licenses they need that would allow them to get that full context. So we'll go over auditing real quick. So it amazes me, but up until January 2019, mailbox auditing was not enabled by default in Exchange Online. So unless your IT people went in there and enabled auditing, no logs. Microsoft fixed that. That's something I would still recommend checking to verify. But in addition to that, I mentioned earlier, that Unified Audit Log is not enabled by default. So you need to make sure your IT people go in there, make sure it's enabled. Because if it's not enabled, if you have an incident, there may not be any logs for you to reference. Also, advanced audit features. So there's a specific attribute called the Mail Items Accessed attribute, and what that allows you to determine, if you have a data breach, you have a mailbox that's compromised, and you're asking the question, what did they access? You need that license and you need that attribute enabled on that mailbox. If it's not enabled, you may have to go with the assumption that everything in that mailbox was compromised. So we've seen that happen a lot. So that's another important consideration. You need to have it licensed and you need to have it enabled if you want to be able to answer those questions. So the first time you go to the Unified Audit Log, I've got a link here at the bottom of the slide. It's protection.office.com/Unified Audit Log. You'll see that pop up at the top that says to use this feature, turn on auditing so we can start recording user and admin activity in your organization. you've got to go on there and turn that on. Not enabled by default. I'm still seeing clients in 2022 that don't have that enabled, and it amazes me. I don't know why it has not been a default setting this whole time. Okay, so moving on to conditional access and security defaults. So Microsoft includes a feature in every Office 365 subscription called security defaults. And what this does, it's on the screenshot on the left, it's a yes or no toggle, so it's either off or it's on. Whenever you turn it on, it does 4 things. It enforces multi-factor authentication for everybody, no exceptions. It disables those legacy authentication protocols I mentioned earlier that the bad guys are targeting via password sprays. It enforces risk-based MFA, but that can be highly problematic or disruptive because you might have service accounts that get used that you can't register for MFA, or you can't make exceptions for those legacy protocols. So it can be very disruptive. It doesn't allow for any exceptions based on your business requirements whatsoever. And so a lot of clients, especially in higher education, will have to opt for conditional access. So this is kind of going a step beyond that. It's very granular and customizable, but it requires additional licensing. You have to have Azure AD Premium P1 licenses, which may or may not be included with your Office 365 subscription. So to use that feature, you need to be licensed for it, but this will allow you to do things like geo-blocking. You could block all sign-ins from outside the United States if you wanted to. You could, and another thing to consider is, especially in higher education, you may not be able to apply the same type of policy for faculty as you do staff. You may not be able to apply the same policy for faculty and staff that you do students. So you probably need that granularity and flexibility that those premium licenses are going to allow for you with the conditional access. Now, the good news is, and I've got links here at the bottom for your reference, that Microsoft has released an easy button, because what we've seen happen a lot is organizations have enabled conditional access policies, they've misconfigured them and they've inadvertently locked people out, or they didn't configure them the way that it needs to be configured and there were gaps in that coverage. But Microsoft has given you an easy button. They've got the most common conditional access policies they recommend, and you can set this up in 3 seconds. So very easy to set up. You just go to create a policy from a template, and it does the work for you. Now, I do recommend, if you use that feature, set it into report-only mode first, and then monitor the logs over a week or 2. Make sure that the policy is working as you expect it to before you enforce it. You also want to exclude at least one person, one global administrator from the policy. That way, if you do inadvertently configure the policy, you don't lock everybody out of Office 365. We've seen that happen too. Okay, so I mentioned password spray attacks. This happens all the time for organizations that don't block those legacy protocols. It's not uncommon for us to see, especially with thousands of accounts, tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of password sprays per tenant per month. And that's where, the bad guys are going to take a common password that gets used everywhere. Password 1, summer, winter, company name here. This could also be the name of your university or college. Use like college name 2022 exclamation, or maybe your mascot. Those are other types of passwords people that will commonly select that are prone to those password spray attacks. So if you're somebody who's responsible for your password policy in your organization, this is actually the guidance for password guidance for admins from Microsoft. And what they state, and I actually increased this by character because they typically state at least 8 character minimum. I recommend you do at least 9 characters. You also should encourage people to use a passphrase. So a passphrase is maybe 3 or 4 words and can be all lowercase. You don't have to do numbers, you don't have to do special characters. And then the next thing is, and this seems counterintuitive based on what we've been told for years, but Microsoft is saying don't require character composition requirements, don't require special character. What else do they say here? They say don't require mandatory periodic password resets. They're saying don't make your staff or faculty change their password every 90 days. Why are they saying that? Because what we've seen through the research is that when you force people to change their passwords frequently, they're much more likely to find a common formula and to slightly tweak that every 2-3 months. If you allow people, more time, say change their password once or twice a year, they're more likely to pick a really good password or a really good passphrase because they don't have to change it as frequently. That's what the research suggests, and that's what we've seen over time. And then also the other thing that you need to do is ban common passwords. Like if I go to, by default in Active Directory, if I go to change my password to password1 exclamation or summer 2022 exclamation, Active Directory is not going to stop me. But if you implement a password filter with Active Directory, it will stop me. It's going to force me to sit there and think, okay, this is a common formula. It's in a variety of data breaches. I need to think harder about this. And so that's the stick that you're getting slapped with, being forced to pick a good password. But the carrot is that you don't have to change your password as often, and you don't have to do upper lower number special. You could do just an all lowercase passphrase. So it's a bit of a compromise, and it does lead to better password outcomes. It leads to people picking better passwords or passphrases. And then the other thing is to educate people not to reuse their passwords, because a lot of these data breaches happen from they pick a password and they use it everywhere. Use it for your LinkedIn, use it for Facebook, use it for maybe your bank account. If you use the same or similar password in multiple places, it only takes your account getting hacked in one place, and then the threat actors are going to try to target those other accounts. So, and if you use a password manager, like 1Password, LastPass, KeePass, there's a lot of solutions out there. That's much better than the alternative of using a similar password in multiple places, and it can make it easy for you. Like I use 1Password, and when I log into my bank account, when I log into my credit card account, when I log into Facebook, I have no idea what my password is. It's something totally random and unique, but I just open it up on my phone or on my MacBook, on my computer, and I only have to remember 1Password. That's my master password. And in some cases, I don't even have to do that. Like my iPhone will scan my face and log me into my password manager, and then it will fill in my credentials for me so that I don't even have to do that. So it actually makes it easier for me, and it ensures that I'm not at risk for those credential stuffing or breach replay type attacks. And then lastly, you need to ensure that all of your, especially staff and faculty, register for multi-factor authentication. If you only need a password to get into your account, passwords are easily guessed and stolen through attacks like phishing. Okay, so I mentioned a default setting earlier, which is grant consent to unmanaged applications. By default, in every Office 365 environment, anybody can grant consent to any application. And what we're starting to see is the bad guys, rather than trying to steal users' credentials, because more organizations are starting to implement MFA, they're trying to convince users to register an application that the attacker controls and grants them access to their account and their data. And even if you have multi-factor authentication in place, you can still be susceptible to this. So I recommend changing that. I've got a couple of links at the bottom of this slide that go into more detail. I've highlighted in red on this slide which account setting that is, but you want to flip that to no and set up an approval process where admins can review those requests, preferably. You can also change it to where users can grant consent to applications that are from verified publishers and have low impact permissions, so it's not a high risk. And they could still grant consent for those apps, but not anything that's not published or maybe a risky permission. Okay, lastly, this is the last thing on cloud security. Microsoft has a metric called the Secure Score. And so it's a measurement of your security posture with a higher number indicating more improvement actions that have been implemented. And it's not a measurement of how likely you are to experience a data breach. I've got a link there at the bottom. If you go to securitymicrosoft.com/secure score, you can see what your score is. You can see how you compare to the industry average. One thing to keep in mind is if you use something that's third party, say like you've got a third party email filter, or you use like Duo or Okta, some type of third-party tool for multi-factor authentication, you'll need to go in there and then mark those improvement actions as met by third party to get credit for those points. But if you've not yet assessed your cloud security for 365, I highly recommend that you start here. And again, that's a free tool, doesn't cost anything, and you'll see that most of these improvement actions are things that we've been discussing throughout the cloud security section. MFA, block legacy authentication, don't allow people to grant consent to unmanaged applications. Okay, the next thing we want to discuss is the human firewall. So your people can be the last line of defense against a cyber attack, and that's why it's so important for all employees to get continuous and relevant training, as in also engaging and efficient training. You can also make it easier for people to report suspicious or potentially phishing emails with freely available tools like a phish alert button that integrates in your Outlook app, so that your staff or faculty, they've only got to click a single button in their Outlook. Makes it real quick and easy for them to report suspicious emails. And then also backups. You need to abide by the 3-2-1 rule for backups. That's 3 copies of data, 2 different types of media, and then 1 offsite or offline copy. And then you also need to ensure that you can meet your recovery time objectives. Now, what's the responsibility for your users? They need to know what cybersecurity tools are available to them to protect data and company resources. They need to familiarize themselves with the organization's policy and best practices. They need to follow those best practices and know how to report suspicious activity or a potential breach of data. And they also need to complete mandatory training provided by your organization. Okay, we'll move to proactive cybersecurity management and monitoring. So ideally, a proactive cybersecurity program should be led by a team of cybersecurity professionals. Have a process to identify cybersecurity risk and develop and adapt a roadmap to address cybersecurity risks. And then also provide continuous monitoring of cybersecurity events and staying up to date on critical cybersecurity advisories. That's like Log4j, Print Nightmare. And then have a process to proactively evaluate security tools and policies. So Dean Dorton does have a service called the Cybersecurity Scorecard, and this is kind of what it looks like. But it's multiple domains of security that we assess, which include endpoint security, account security, external security, and then we assign our clients a risk grade, which has it's a risk from minimal, low, medium, high, or severe, which has a corresponding letter grade. So we actually give the client a letter grade. And that shows you where your deficiencies are, where your gaps in control coverage are, and can really kind of help you develop and craft a roadmap to go from what your current state is to your desired state. So developing a cybersecurity roadmap should help you align your security process with business goals and optimize them to optimize your security posture. With a solid roadmap, you should know where you stand today and where you need to go to be more effective and what you need to do to get there. It's a powerful way to ensure security projects map to the business and the business requirements and get you the executive buy-in that you need to enable success. Now, the roadmap is not a static thing. It's dynamic. It should change over time as you grow, as the infrastructure changes, as you implement additional processes or functions, as your budget changes, as the cybersecurity threats evolve, as your technology life cycles change. And then also, you may have changes in regulatory requirements that require you to go back and adjust your roadmap to whatever those new regulatory requirements are. And then also, if you have a third party or vendor agreement that changes, that's something else that needs to be assessed and incorporated as part of the roadmap. Another thing that you should be doing is validating controls. So as you have controls that change in the environment, making sure there's a change control process and that you assess those changes for cybersecurity risks and then adapt your roadmap to those risks. So a good information security program consists of key 3 things, which is people, processes, and technology. And you can't really buy your way into a secure environment. It helps, but technology alone is not going to get you there. You need to have strong and repeatable processes to support the tools that are in place, and you need to have controls and processes that should be designed to adapt as threats evolved and designed to make sure you get the most out of your technology investments. And then people, I think at the end of the day, that's the most important thing here is your people. You need to make sure that they're trained effectively to prevent human error, and then also they're trained against the latest cybersecurity threats, how to spot those red flags. And then you also should, if you are insourcing your IT security, you need to be sure that you're investing in your security staff so that they have the training and executive support they need to be effective at meeting the security requirements and the business objectives. So I want to go over cybersecurity insurance real quick, some things we've observed. So they've had some severe claims and adverse loss ratios, and so they've been increased. We've seen ranges between 15% and 250% increase in premiums. We've seen some cybersecurity insurance companies that have come out and, with coverage restrictions, so they won't even some of them won't even cover any ransomware claims now. And then also we've seen much more onerous and stringent cybersecurity requirements that they're including on their renewals. So I've seen some lately where they don't only want MFA for all external access, they want MFA for all internal admin access, which is very strict. And then we're getting to the end here. I've got a checklist for you, for your IT security people. So we'll start with the first part, encryption for sensitive data. Make sure it's encrypted in transit, at rest. Make sure you encrypt your backups. Privilege access management. To abide by the principle of least privilege, your users should not be local admins. They should not have shared accounts. They need unique accounts. And they should have separate accounts. So standard account, admin accounts, cloud, and preferably, you really need to look at that tiered access model to mitigate the risk of ransomware. Multi-factor authentication, you should have that in place for all remote access, including third parties. Internal privileged access preferably, as well as any core applications that have sensitive data that are hosted by a third party. Employee training they should be trained for cybersecurity threats during onboarding. It should be ongoing. It should be specific to their role, ideally, and they should get periodic knowledge tests and simulations for a highly effective program. I mentioned advanced email security earlier. Those are the 3 types of features that are highly effective at mitigating a lot of email-based threats. Impersonation protection, if they have somebody that tries to impersonate an internal user, rewriting those hyperlinks so that every link in an email gets scanned, and then sandboxing for attachments so that they get analyzed on their behavior. Also, if you really want effective endpoint security, you should be looking at tools like Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, CrowdStrike, Carbon Black, SentinelOne. EDR is the tool. Managed detection and response gives you it gives you the tool, the processes, and the people. That's where you're outsourcing the management of that tool to a third party. Then ideally you should have some type of intrusion prevention system to detect potential intrusions. I mentioned the backups earlier. You need to abide by the 3-2-1 rule for backups. 3 copies of data, 2 different types of media, and 1 off-site copy. Vulnerability management, you should preferably do continuous scanning and have a highly effective and proactive patch management program. A lot of these ransomware threat actors are taking advantage of these patches. If you're running months behind on patches, then you are a candidate or a high risk of a ransomware attack. And then I do recommend that periodically you have a security assessment or a penetration test performed by a third party so they can find the gaps in control coverage in your environment before the bad guys do. And then lastly, I've got a cloud security checklist here. This goes over everything that we've discussed over cloud security. I've got references from Microsoft and from CISA, as well as others. If your organization has not yet rolled out MFA, I've got some free materials from Microsoft that can make that whole process a lot easier and less onerous on your users. And then Microsoft licensing is incredibly confusing. So I've got some really good references on Microsoft licenses to help it make better sense for you as well. So feel free to follow up with me via email, and I would be happy to answer any other questions that you have. And I appreciate your time today and apologize for going over. So do we have time for questions or not?
Maybe we're in the middle of a break, so I think those who want to take a break can take a break, but those who want to ask questions, I think you can stay up there for those who want to ask questions.
Okay.